You are presented with 3 options. 1. Save the innocent man. 2. Let him die. 3. Demand payment before helping him. The music fades. The camera pushes closer. Your companions start to stare at you, waiting for a decision that appears capable of changing everything. So you make your choice. And 5 minutes later, all 3 options have led to the same quest, the same battle, and the same cinematic. The innocent man survives because the story needs him. Your companions remain because their content costs too much to lose. And the decision that supposedly belonged to you is quietly overwritten by the game itself. That is the magic trick behind countless modern RPGs. They give us the dialogue wheels, morality meters, and dramatic notifications declaring that characters will remember what you did. They allow us to sound heroic, sarcastic, or even outright cruel. But they rarely allow us to become dangerous to the story itself. We don't get to decide what happens. We select the attitude which our character accepts what is always going to happen. Some illusion is unavoidable. No developer can create a completely different 100-hour adventure for every player. Choices must reconnect. Budgets have limits, and every possible outcome has been written, recorded, animated, and, well, mostly tested. The problem is not that RPGs have boundaries. The problem is that many games now sell those boundaries as freedom. They want the emotional impact of consequence without allowing anything important to be lost. They want us to believe that every decision matters while protecting the characters, the quests, and the expensive cinematics that our decisions should be capable of destroying. And once you recognize how the trick works, the illusion becomes almost impossible to ignore. So let's pull back the curtain and examine how modern RPGs manufacture player freedom, why genuine narrative agency has become so rare, and what separates a convincing illusion from a choice that actually matters. And if all of that sounds interesting to you, make sure you like, subscribe, hype, all that good stuff, and let's get right into it. RPGs have always been magic tricks. Every open world has an edge. Every conversation has a limited number of responses. Every supposedly unpredictable adventure is built from content somebody had to write, program, and again, somewhat test. And as players, we understand this. Nobody expects a game to react when we attempt to abandon the main story, become a baker, and spend 40 years selling bread to passing adventurers. We agree to ignore the boundaries because believing in the world is part of that experience. But there was once an agreement attached to that illusion. If a game asked us to make a decision, that decision should reveal something about our character, change something within the world, or force us to sacrifice something to obtain another thing. It doesn't need to rewrite the entire campaign. Maybe a companion can lose faith in us. Maybe a merchant refuses to deal with us. Maybe saving one settlement leaves another one completely vulnerable. The consequences of these can be small, but the game needs to remember long enough for the decision to feel real. Modern RPGs often replace that consequence with personality, and the clearest example of this is Fallout 4. The 4-option dialogue wheel appeared to provide several approaches to a conversation. In practice, the choices frequently amounted to yes, sarcastic yes, ask a question before saying yes, and no, but only until you eventually say yes. You could decide how the sole survivor sounded, but rarely whether they would participate. The interface presented 4 possibilities, while the quest structure waited for one acceptable answer. And I don't think it's fair to say that this is completely worthless. Choosing whether a character responds with compassion, humor, or aggression can help players define their personality. Expression is definitely a big part of role-playing, but the expression should not be the main agency. Deciding how your character feels about a mission is different from deciding whether they accept it and how they complete it or who benefits from the outcome. That distinction matters because RPGs increasingly use the appearance of choice to disguise a fixed protagonist. The game may allow you to create their face, select their background, and distribute their statistics, but when the story begins, their important decisions have already been made. They will pursue the central mystery. They will visit the required locations. They will cooperate with the characters the plot still needs. The player controls everything except the direction of their life. And at that point, why bother presenting the conversation as any form of a decision-making situation at all? Because a linear story isn't really a failure. Some of gaming's greatest narratives work precisely because the protagonist has a defined personality, history, and motivation. Geralt of Rivia, he's far from an empty vessel. The player can influence him, but The Witcher never pretends he would behave like absolutely anyone else. The problem begins when a game wants the control of a linear story and the marketing appeal of limitless freedom. It can give us a dialogue wheel, not because the story will branch out, but because clicking an answer keeps us involved in a scene whose outcome has already been predetermined. And eventually, players will recognize this pattern. We stop asking questions like, what would my character say? And instead we will just ask, which option will continue the quest the quickest? That's the moment the illusion begins to collapse. Not when we discover the game has boundaries, when we realize the choice was only there to stop us from seeing them. Once a game has offered the appearance of control, it needs to maintain that illusion. The easiest method is delayed convergence. Two choices appear to send the story in different directions. You select a different companion, enter through a different location, or receive a unique piece of dialogue. And for a few moments, it feels like the game has responded to your choice. Then the paths quietly reconnect. The same enemy appears, the same character survives, the same cinematic will play. Your decision changed the journey just long enough to convince you that it might change the entire destination. But these branching stories always have to reconnect eventually. Otherwise, every decision would double the amount of content developers need to create. The convergence itself isn't the problem. The problem is when a choice leaves no evidence behind. If it's been decided that the two routes are going to return to the main story, how you arrive there should still matter. Someone might resent you, a companion might be absent, a resource might become unavailable. You should gain something from your chosen route as well as lose something from the one that you've rejected. A choice should always leave some type of a scar. Instead, many RPGs erase the wound and replace it with a notification. Someone liked that. Your reputation increased. This settlement will remember your actions or some shit like that. These messages announce that something important happened before the game has proven it. They're really nothing more than just applause signs telling the players to feel the weight of a consequence that will probably never arrive. Sometimes remembering means one altered line of dialogue 20 hours later. The world hasn't changed, it's merely acknowledged that the game stored a variable. Companion approval systems can be equally artificial. In theory, they create characters with beliefs and boundaries. A compassionate companion should challenge cruel behavior. A loyal soldier should respond differently from a cynical mercenary. In practice, players quickly discover the equation underneath the personality. Select the response they approve of, give them the correct gifts, avoid actions that subtract points, fill an invisible bar until the loyalty mission or romance scene unlocks. A relationship that should feel complicated becomes just another progression system, which you can optimize. Reducing every decision to hero points or villain points doesn't encourage ethical thought, it encourages commitment to whichever side offers the reward that you want. Once players know the system values extremes, the dilemma completely disappears. We weren't asking what we believe, we were grinding towards an ending or an outcome we wanted. But the most effective part of the illusion has nothing to do with complicated systems. It's the presentation. The camera pushes closer, the music falls silent, characters just stare at the player, and a timer begins counting down beside two drastic options. Every cinematic signal tells us that this moment is irreversible. Then we choose, and nothing important changes. High quality presentation can make an ordinary conversation feel like a turning point. It creates emotional pressure even when the decision has no mechanical pressure behind it. And on a first playthrough, that works brilliantly. And then it usually falls apart on replays. You return to the same moment and choose the option you rejected last time. You expect a new enemy, or a lost companion, or an altered mission, but instead what you get is a character that changes one sentence in a generic response, and then the same quest marker will appear. Suddenly you see the machinery underneath the scene. The morality points, the approval values, and the dialogue branches stop resembling human relationships and start looking like a code. The magician hasn't changed the trick, you simply move far enough to see the man behind the curtain. And once you know what's there, every future choice just becomes so much harder to believe. And it's easy to blame all of this on simple case of lazy developers, but the truth is a little bit more complicated. Modern AAA development actively punishes narrative freedom. Imagine a player makes one decision that kills a companion halfway through the game. Every scene involving that character now needs an alternate version. Every conversation must account for their absence, and every quest they provide must disappear or be reassigned. Future cinematics need different animations, different camera positions, and different dialogue. Now, introduce another choice that destroys a settlement, or another one that completely removes a full faction. Each branch intersects with every decision that came before it. Writers need to account for the combinations, actors need to record alternative dialogue, and developers build scenes most players will never encounter. Quality assurance teams test every sequence to ensure the game doesn't collapse, unless this is Bethesda. So that would mean that one meaningful choice can create months of invisible work. A dozen can create development nightmare. Older RPGs had more room to hide that complexity. A different outcome might require new text inside a familiar environment. Characters could deliver alternative responses without every line needing to be voice acted, and facial animations and motion captured and all that type of stuff. Modern RPGs are expected to deliver cinematic performances. A conversation lasting 5 minutes can involve actors, writers, directors, animators, cinematic designers, programs, and audio engineers. Once a scene becomes that expensive, publishers want as many players as possible to see it, so the story is forced to become a funnel. The opening feels enormous. Players choose their appearance, background, statistics, and personality, and the game promises hundreds of possible identities. But as the story progresses and the production becomes more elaborate, those possibilities are gradually squeezed together. You can be heroic, you can be cruel, loyal or selfish, intelligent or reckless. But you must visit the city containing the next major set piece. The villain must survive until their scheduled cinematic, and the companion featured in the finale cannot be allowed to die during a random argument 20 hours earlier. And sequels make this problem even worse. If one game ends with several possible governments, destroyed locations, or a dead major character, the next installment must account for every combination or choose which version of this officially happened and become considered canon. Developers, of course, can attempt to import our decisions, but these choices often return as minor dialogue changes or brief cameos. Alternatively, one outcome becomes canon and every other player's story is quietly erased. This is why many RPGs save their largest decisions for the final hour, because at that point a slideshow can tell us that a nation has collapsed, or a faction seized power, or an entire civilization entered a new age. The game doesn't have to build those consequences because we never get to play inside of them. Technically, our choices did change the world, we just don't get to experience the world that we created. Now, this doesn't mean that developers are secretly hiding limitless options of their games from us. Genuine branching is expensive and nearly impossible to sustain across a 100-hour production. Difficult to test and nearly impossible to sustain. But those limitations should lead to honesty. If a game is telling a fixed story, just be confident and tell it. Give us a defined protagonist with meaningful character development. There's nothing wrong with linear narratives when the game understands what it is. The problem is selling a controlled cinematic experience as a limitless role-playing adventure. Modern RPGs want the storytelling and precision of a film and the marketing language of a tabletop campaign. They tell us that every decision matters, while ensuring that none of those decisions can damage the scene that they've spent millions of dollars creating. So yes, the technology has improved, worlds have gotten bigger, and performances have become more convincing overall, but beneath all of that progress, the player's influence is feeling smaller than ever, because the more expensive the story becomes, the less willing the game is to let us break it. So, if branching paths and different endings aren't enough, what makes a choice genuinely matter? I would say 3 things: uncertainty, sacrifice, and memory. The player shouldn't immediately know which option produces the best outcome. Choosing one path should mean losing access to another, and once the decision is made, the game must remember it long enough for the consequence to feel real. And I would argue that The Witcher 3 understands this better than most. During the Bloody Baron storyline, Geralt discovers a spirit trapped beneath the Whispering Hillock. The crones want it dead, and the spirit claims it can rescue a group of children who will otherwise disappear. And the game does not provide you with a clean answer. If you choose to free the spirit and the children survive, then Downwarren is massacred. Anna is cursed, and her death ultimately drives the Baron to suicide. Kill the spirit, and the village survives, but the children are taken away by the crones. Anna lives, although her mind is shattered, and the Baron carries her away in search of treatment that may not even exist. There is no heroic option where everyone survives. There's no morality meter revealing which decision the developers consider to be the correct one. You make a judgment using incomplete information, then discover the cost after it's too late to reverse it. That is a consequence. The decision doesn't create an entirely new final act. It doesn't alter Geralt's ultimate objective, but it permanently changes the lives connected to the story. The game remembers what you did and refuses to protect you from your potential regret. Fallout New Vegas creates agency on a much larger scale. The NCR, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House, and an independent Vegas aren't cosmetic variations of the same faction. Supporting one changes your objectives. It also changes your allies and who will ultimately control the Mojave. Your behavior affects how groups respond before the credits. Companions can abandon you. Entire quest lines can close and be blocked off from you. Important characters can die long before the story is finished using them. The game adapts because the player is allowed to damage the game's plans. And that is messy freedom for a video game. You can destroy useful relationships, lose valuable content, and create an outcome that is objectively worse than the one the other player receives. But the damage proves that the decision you made was your decision. Baldur's Gate 3 takes a similar approach by allowing failure to become part of the adventure. Characters can die outside of carefully scripted moments. Alliances can collapse, and a failed dice roll can close one opportunity while creating another. Entire storylines can disappear because the player made a reckless decision or simply failed to understand what was at risk. And the game frequently continues instead of demanding that you reload and perform the intended sequence. And that matters because agency is not only the freedom to select different content, it's the freedom to lose content in a game. If every companion is protected because their scenes were expensive to create, threatening their life means nothing. If every faction remains available until the final mission, loyalty carries no cost. If failure always returns you to a checkpoint, then failure was never allowed to become part of your story. A reactive RPG must occasionally look the player in the eye and say, well, you chose this, so now something from the game is gone from you. Developers aren't solely responsible for the death of meaningful choices. As players, we helped kill them. We say we want decisions with permanent consequences, but the moment a choice threatens to lock us out of a weapon, a companion, an achievement, or a potential romance, many of us stop role-playing and open up a guide. Can I save both characters? What option is going to give me the best reward? Will this companion leave me if I make this choice? Can I still unlock my desired ending? Before the consequences can surprise us, we reduce the decision to a list of rewards and penalties. We demand freedom and then optimize the uncertainty of that freedom out of the game. And developers know how their audiences behave for the most part. They know players hate missing content. They know permanent consequences can be interpreted as punishment. And they know that someone will spend 80 hours making a decision, dislike the ending, and then blame the game for failing to explain exactly what every other option would cause. So developers have decided to play it safe. Dialogue options receive obvious morale labels, approval notifications are appearing immediately, and the game warns us about points of no return. Major decisions are delayed until the final act, where they can no longer remove large amounts of playable content. If we really want games to feel less scripted, we need to stop judging them solely by how much content they allow us to consume, and we need to accept shorter games, missed quests, and imperfect outcomes. And developers must be willing to let us break the story, and as players, we must be willing to live with the pieces that we have broken. So narrative choice isn't something that is completely dead, but too many modern RPGs have replaced it with the performance of choice. They give us dialogue wheels, morality meters, and dramatic pauses. They tell us our companions approved, and our reputation has changed and the world will remember our decisions. But when the moment passes, the game repairs whatever damage we supposedly caused. The companion ends up staying with us, the quest continues onward, and the branches reconnect. And the expensive cinematic plays exactly as it was intended to. Developers do not need to create infinite possibilities. They don't need to reward completely different campaigns or hundreds of hours of content most players will never see. A choice only needs to change something that we care about and remain changed. Let the companion leave. Let the faction become enemies. Let the quest fail. And let our strengths open doors and our weaknesses close them. And most importantly, let us make decisions that the story cannot quietly take back. If we act without understanding the consequences, allow the mistake to become part of our journey. If we choose one faction over another, make us face the people we have chosen to betray. If someone dies because of our actions, don't replace them with another character delivering the same dialogue. And players need to accept the other side of the agreement that comes along with this. We cannot demand meaningful consequences while expecting to complete every quest, earn every reward, and reach the perfect ending on our first playthrough. True player freedom requires the possibility of loss. The greatest RPG stories aren't necessarily the ones with the largest worlds, the most dialogue options, or the highest quality cinematics. They're the ones where two players can reach the credits, compare what happened, and realize they experienced genuinely different journeys from one another. That is the promise at the heart of role-playing games. Not that we can do absolutely anything, not that every decision will create an entire new world, but when a game looks us in the eye and asks us to choose, it has the courage to respect our answer. Because if every road leads to the same destination, eventually the dialogue wheel stops looking like choices of freedom and starts looking like the magician's hand, keeping us distracted while the game is making the real choice behind our backs.